Catherine McClellan, Deputy CEO for Assessment at the Australian Council for Educational Research, and for myself and all of my ACER colleagues, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. Now, let's begin the third webinar in our series, Reducing the Long Tail of Underachievement, the Big Five Challenges in Education in a Changed World. Registrations for the fourth webinar in this series are now open. The link will be emailed to all attendees after today's session, and we hope to see you there as well. Now, on to the content you came for. In August 2015, ACER CEO Geoff Masters published a Teacher magazine column describing 5 significant challenges in Australian education. Expanded discussions of these were consolidated into a policy insights paper in the following year. 6 years and a global pandemic later, have we made progress in meeting those challenges? This webinar is the third in a series with experts in each area to explore that question. Our experts today are the Smith Family's Head of Research and Advocacy, Anne Hampshire, Victorian teacher Steven Kolber, and ACER's own Dr. Sue Thomson. Those 3 have come here today to discuss the third challenge, which, as stated in the article, is to find better ways to meet the learning needs of the many students who fall behind in our schools, fail to meet year-level expectations, often year after year, and as a consequence, become increasingly disengaged. These 3 are here to share their views on how we can better understand and address this persistent discrepancy between what our education system needs to deliver for all learners to thrive and what they receive. So let's dive in and start with the first question for our panelists. So I'm going to start with a baseline one. What is the long tail of underachievement? How persistent is it? Is it particular to Australia? Do you see it in other countries? And where or when does it start? And Sue, I think we'll start with you.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine, for that. The long tail of underachievement, it's an interesting it's an interesting phenomenon, and one that is actually seen in many countries in the world. In fact, if you Google long tail of underachievement, you'll find articles from Canada, from the US, from New Zealand, from England, all talking about their long tail of underachievement. So it's not something that's particularly Australian, but at the same time, there are aspects of it that I think are particularly common to Australia, and there's aspects of it I think we need to look at. So in terms of what is the long tail of underachievement, we're talking about kids who, as the article says originally, who fail to grow, who spend year after year falling behind, who keep falling behind, and who basically seem to have no hope of catching up. And we'll talk about that a little bit further, but in a follow-up question, looking at what the PISA definition, which has become the definition of the long tail of underachievement. And so we'll look at what that actually means in terms of practical baselines and things like that. So we'll look at that a bit later, but it is that long tail. I think Geoff talking about that long tail of underachievement being a whole range of kids who are just not meeting what our expectations would be. Steven or Anne, would you like to talk about this as well?
Thanks, Sue. I think we've got some really useful data which includes the PISA data, but if we look at financially disadvantaged children, for example, and all of the other subgroups we might talk about, what I think we see in Australia through a range of measures, if we look at the Australian Early Development Census, for example, if we then look at NAPLAN, if we then look at Year 12 completion, and then finally, what are young people doing post-school, there is a group of students repeatedly in that group. Predominantly, a lot of them are, not all, but some of them are from low SES, some of them are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. So I think the slightly disturbing thing for the work of the Smith family, for example, is that we're not actually seeing that schools, despite their best efforts, are seeing that being smoothed out. So yes, children might start school behind, but by the time we get to Year 12, we've got a gap of about 25% in terms of who completes Year 12 and who doesn't. And I think all know, and I think we might talk a little bit later, Catherine, about the consequences of not meeting some of those important milestones.
For me, from my perspective, it's very easy because they're students and we see them. It begins before they even enter school. I know with grade 4 kinder, year 4 kinder, age 4 kinder is now a free thing that we have. So I think that might be a positive step because there's a body of research that seems to suggest that the earlier you start students in school, the better that they will do. But basically, as the tail, as we refer to it quite vaguely here, as they move through the system, they don't progress as quickly as their peers, and therefore in each year of their schooling, they're falling further behind. And so doing, they're much harder for teachers to reach. So if I'm, say, teaching a class of year sevens, but I have a couple of students that are at a grade 3 level for literacy, numeracy, or whatever I'm teaching, that becomes a significant issue for me as a teacher to address their learning needs, because my specialisation, my teacherly knowledge is sort of limited to a certain range. And if they're beyond that, then that becomes a problem. And that's when we need charities and a whole bunch of other people to chip in. And as much as possible, schools are working to address that tail every day.
Geoff mentions in his article not only achievement measures, but also student disengagement as a consequence of being in the long tail of underachievement. And what are the consequences when students disengage with education?
From the research perspective, certainly one of the consequences of student disengagement with education, certainly early, is that they don't continue with their education. We want all kids to finish at least year 12 and then go on and either earn or learn. So either going into some sort of work or into some sort of further training. If kids become disengaged with education, I think, to me as a teacher, I guess, one of the things that used to always break my heart is that they switch themselves off from everything that goes on after that. If they become disengaged with education in year 7, there's all of that time ahead of them that they're not making the most of it, they're not enjoying what they're doing, and then they're not going to go on and make the best of what they could be doing. And I think, to me, it's that wasted potential that worries me, the disengagement with school and the disengagement with education and even learning. We all have to keep learning. We had to learn how to use Zoom last year. We had to learn how to use all sorts of things last year. Very steep learning curves that we had to do. If you're disengaged from learning, you might be disengaged from all sorts of learning. So I guess from the research perspective, that's what would worry me, and from a teaching perspective. And Stephen, I'm sure that would resonate with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of, as a teacher, it becomes harder and harder to re-engage because you're starting from, years of sort of damaged ego, self-esteem, whatever it is, rather than starting, arriving at the beginning of the year with the sense that I can achieve in this class, this school, this learning group, whatever it is. You're instead trying to remediate the kind of, in some respects, like, genuine mental health concerns, but also more just quite simply learning, damage. I don't know how to really phrase it, but it's kind of like that sense that you don't have, you're not empowered, you don't have the ability to catch up to your peers and to be involved. You don't feel like you're actually a part of the school or a part of the class. And that's probably throwing to Anne where the Smith family picks it up.
Yeah. And Catherine, I think as Stephen was saying, there are consequences during school, but also there are consequences for us when we're adults if we're not achieving educationally. And yes, Sue was talking about a hard outcome of learning or earning, and that's an important part of well-being, etc. But there's also some other outcomes which come with education, and that tends to be stronger health, stronger social capital, stronger engagement in the community. So there's a whole lot of things that get broken down if young people cease to be engaged in education and don't have the opportunity to have the choices that they would actually more naturally fit into if they're able to complete year 12. So there are just so many consequences of not achieving, and I think some of the ones that Stephen just alluded to, it's how you feel as an individual and how you're valued by perhaps community and society because of that.
Thanks. In the article, the results from PISA, so you referenced earlier, indicate about 1 in 7 Australian students in reading and about 1 in 5 in maths have not achieved the international baseline. Could you give us an update on the current situation in this challenge? Have things improved? Have they gotten worse? What's changed?
Oh, I wish I could say they'd gotten better. I have not been able to do that with PISA yet in 20 years of reporting on it, unfortunately. The numbers have actually shown a continuing worsening in performance in each of those areas, and it's now about 1 in 5 Australian students who don't achieve the international standard in reading and science, and almost 1 in 4 in mathematics, which is very concerning on its own merits. But when we look at how we compare internationally, what we find is that internationally we've continued to go down, whereas a lot of other countries have actually improved their performance. So it's not just a matter of Australia has sort of dropped their performance and other countries have stayed the same. We've actually gotten worse compared to a number of other countries. And looking at the baseline, if I can just jump forward a little bit on that, we talk about that as the baseline. So that's the OECD baseline, which is now the level of proficiency for the UN sustainability goals. And that's considered to be we've got to read this little bit just to make sure it's right. It's essential to ensure the students have the knowledge and skills at that level that allows them to actively and effectively participate in adult life. So that's the baseline, and it is a really basic level. Students who are below that level are able to respond to familiar stimuli. They're able to follow basic texts and instructions, but they aren't able to then extrapolate that information or pick out hidden meaning or do a whole range of other things. And in terms of mathematics, they can do the basics, and that's about it. And we were looking at this the other day when we were talking about the complexity of loan forms, for example, to fill out for credit cards, to understand the finance behind credit cards, to understand that if you don't pay off your minimum balance, that you're going to be hit with a huge interest rate. You know, all of those little things, they're part of mathematical literacy that is really essential. Being able to fill out forms. When my dog was sick the other day, I had to measure her medication depending on her weight. If you don't understand how that works, you can quite easily overdose an animal or a child or yourself because you don't understand those things. So it is a really basic level. And so the Australian government, or ACER actually, have actually made proficiency level 3, which is 1 level up, the minimum proficiency level for Australia. So that's been determined as a reasonably challenging level of performance where students need to demonstrate more than the minimal skills. But then over PISA cycles, we've seen that falling as well, of course. So now the number of students achieving that level has fallen from 69% to 59% in reading, from 67% to 54% in maths, from 67 to 58% in science. It's not great if we're trying to encourage students to do STEM careers, for example, or to think about jobs in STEM. I was a bit discouraged when I realised that only just over half of our kids achieve that level in mathematics. And it's not, as I said, it's not a high level, but only just half of them are getting above that level, which is really a very scary thought.
We all know we're sort of in the middle of a global pandemic because here we are on Zoom having this meeting. And so one of the things I think you've heard a lot about learning loss and the impact of the pandemic on education and student outcomes and student mental health and emotional wellness. So how has the global pandemic interacted with this issue around achievement? Do we know yet? And if not, how are we likely to find out?
Catherine, I might kick off with just some of the experiences of the students that the Smith family supports. And I think what the pandemic has done is exacerbate pre-existing gaps. So I don't think we yet know how we might quantify the learning gap. But what happened with the pandemic, understandably, when schools closed, there was the issue for many of the children that the Smith family supports of access to digital. And so whilst we as an organisation have been talking probably for about 10 years about the digital divide, I think more broadly, I think the community actually felt that wasn't aware of that as an issue. I think what the pandemic has done is really shone a light on digital divide. And so what digital divide can look like is, and this became particularly acute during the pandemic, but I would argue remains very acute, because now I think digital access is really the equivalent of what a school book might have been 10 or 20 years ago. It's a tool of trade for education. So with the students at the Smith Family Supports, about 1 in 5 of them don't have access to the internet at home. And that's probably quite surprising for people generally, because that's expected that all children do. So it became quite challenging for families. And then within the remote learning environment, you might have, even if you did have access to a laptop and the software, you might not have had access to multiple computers, and you might have had 3, 4, 5 children in your home. And then there's the issue of data. And we know from the Digital Inclusion Index, which is done regularly in Australia, that poorer families actually spend a higher proportion of their income on digital-related access. And we also know from the families we work with that in addition to that, there is the issue of digital skills. So having the confidence to support families at home. And if you've got a relatively modest home where there might be, let's say, 5, 6, 7 family members, and you've got perhaps 2 bedrooms, there's actually not a lot of space to be involved in learning. And you might have parents who desperately want to do the best for their children during remote learning. I think most parents found remote learning challenging, but particularly families from disadvantaged backgrounds whose parents might not have completed Year 12 or might not be confident about the Australian education system. I think the pandemic was incredibly challenging, to the point that we had families, parents saying to us, I don't want to be the reason my child is falling behind. I think on the flip side, though, the experience of the Smith family during the pandemic was we saw extraordinary resilience and extraordinary dedication of families to wanting to support their children at home in the learning environment. So really holding on as much as they possibly could in extraordinarily difficult circumstances to really hope that their child wouldn't fall behind. But I think what we're going to see is that, and what we've seen from certainly the UK evidence, is that it's disadvantaged children in particular who've fallen behind. And I think it will take us quite a time to make any improvement on that.
I feel like I should jump in on this one. It's sort of, to me, we've always, or at least people of my ilk have always spoken about the digital divide being a thing, but it felt like during COVID that it broke out of discourse of people like us in this particular call, and it became rather more widespread. I've just finished reading a paper from World Vision, and Jonathan Guy's written an article for Education International about digital equity audits, which is basically sort of how do we go from the fact that we all now generally understand that there's a big gap in access to devices, and to kind of make that a bit more concrete, like the difference between me sitting in this quiet room with my own laptop and several other screens and alt-tabbing as I go versus a student lying on their bed with a cracked iPhone screen. And, maybe some prepaid data is a significant difference. So to me, that's something that we really need to sort of put on the agenda, I guess. In terms of the impact of COVID, we've got sort of 3 perspectives. There's kind of the general discussion that there will be significant learning loss. I've just finished reading Jennifer Gore and a couple of other people's article about New South Wales schools. They found 4,800 grade 3 and 4 students, primary school students, and they couldn't really establish the learning loss that they were expecting, except for grade 3s in mathematics who were disadvantaged, which obviously fits with what we're talking about. And that to me is the sort of the outlier of the information that we have to hand already. And they were using ACER PAT tests. So, bravo to ACER for having that kind of in the absence of NAPLAN lying around for a useful data set to use. But basically, to put it down to a research level, we're not exactly sure. You can look at, earthquakes disrupting schools and those sort of things, but we're not exactly sure because of the unique nature of what's going on. Anecdotally, I would say that a lot of students disengaged from my perspective and from my peers, but that's not something that I can prove to you. but it is something that I experienced and anecdotally I'm aware of. So Sue, I'm sure you can.
I think that was discussed quite a bit too, Stephen. There was quite a few discussions I saw with teachers where they said exactly that, the kids were just disengaging, especially, and I think this is the interesting thing with the pandemic in Australia, which has hit different states in different ways. You know, Victoria, we had such a long lockdown, such a long period of time with kids not at school, and yet in other states they didn't miss any schooling at all. I think Northern Territory kids didn't miss any schooling. So it'll be interesting, I think, to look at the different differential effects of that sort of disengagement. And then I think it's interesting even this year talking to parents about whether their kids have re-engaged with schooling now that they're back all the time. Now that they're back full time, are they re-engaging with it the way that they were, or do they see it differently? So I suspect there might be a bit of research along those lines in the next year or so.
And Catherine, some of what we've heard, a little bit like Stephen was saying, the staff that we have who work with families directly and who also work with schools, some of what they've heard from schools is that schools now have greater visibility of the lives of some of their students than they might have been able to have before. So in some cases, really positively communicated in different ways. And in some senses, that's the seeds of hope and optimism. I think when schools actually have as full a sense as they can of the families who they're supporting, and the pandemic almost forced that to happen in some ways, I think there can be some really positive steps going forward, but it'll be hard for everybody.
And we got a question from the audience that I actually think might fit in nicely here, so I'm going to toss it to you after reading it. The question was, how does the long tail of underachievement in Australia, apparently similar to that of other English-speaking systems, compare to that in other high-performing systems on PISA?
I'd have to stop and have a look at the numbers on that. It's not. I don't see the same long tail of underperformance in any of the high-performing Asian countries, for example. Just off the top of my head, I can think of maybe a couple where there might only be 10%. In fact, I'm even thinking of Ireland. I think there are about 10% of students who are not achieving at that basic level. So it's not just English-speaking countries that have the tail as well. There are quite a number of countries where there's only 6-8% of students who are not achieving at that high level. But then if we start looking at countries like Singapore, we start looking at a very different distribution. I'm just thinking about the TIMS data for Singapore instead of the PISA data, but most of their students are achieving at that top level, and a very few of them are achieving at the bottom level. And I mean, maybe 10% are achieving under level 3, and all the rest of them are achieving at a much higher level. So there are a number of other countries that don't have that long tail, not necessarily just non-English speaking countries as well.
In sort of a summative view of this question around educational achievement and this current issue, what are the bright spots and what are the most worrying findings and trends from your view of this issue? Anne, should we start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I might go to the second question and then perhaps come back to the first one.
Sure.
I think one of and I'll use some research done by the Grattan Institute a couple of years ago, which I think is still relevant. I think one of the most disturbing things out of that research, it compared, and I'll put this simplistically, it compared NAPLAN Year 3 students on a similar level, groups of, let's call them affluent students, and groups of disadvantaged students who were at the same NAPLAN achievement in Year 3. And then it looked at, so you would think, starting same baseline in Sue's terms, you would think and hope that through our great school system, and we do have great schools across the country and great teachers working really hard, that those groups of children would end up at roughly the same point by the time they were in Year 9. But the research from McClellan showed, the Grattan Institute showed that those children, by the time they got to Year 9, there was a 2-year difference in achievement, despite the starting point. And so I personally find that really a disturbing thing, that yes, there can be a whole lot of circumstances in home life and we've got great schools, etc. But we still have children who in Year 3 are at the same point, and by the time they get to Year 9, there's a really significant difference. And consequentially, one would think, a reduced likelihood of them completing Year 12 and going on to all the things we talked about earlier. In terms of bright spots, the Smith family, has 57,000 children on a long-term educational scholarship. They're all disadvantaged students. And whilst that program, Learning for Life program, is still so it's been going for about 30 years and we're still a work in progress and striving to improve that program. I think a number of the things that program over 30 years has taught us are, first of all, that families from disadvantaged backgrounds have enormously high aspirations for their children. So there is not a paucity of aspirations for families from disadvantaged backgrounds. And our experience is, and it's, 57,000 is a lot of students, but it's only a fraction of the students who are living in poverty in Australia, which is 1.2 million children, that if you provide targeted and timely support, so providing, as much of the support that is, yes, financial, but also relational and also as access to a series of programs, educational programs, then you can help children from very disadvantaged backgrounds achieve educationally. And so there are numbers of programs like that, but I think what we need to do, and programs that I think are successful, take account of an ecological model. And I think that's one of our challenges in Australia, is how do we get our respective systems, education, community services, and the related systems working really more closely together, because highly vulnerable children will bring a whole lot of things to the classroom that classroom teachers, some of which they'll be able to deal with, but they will also need other supports. And the sort of, the byline of it takes a village to raise a child, we actually need systems that work together, focused on the child and the family's needs, and think about the child, yes, but also the family context, who are their peers, what school are they going to, and also importantly, what community they live in, because children's outcomes are also very locationally oriented. We're looking now at different year levels, but we could equally look at different geographies. So how do we work as a nation, particularly when we have state and Commonwealth responsibilities, but also an active non-government sector? How do we work more collaboratively together around disadvantaged children? And our experience is it can be done, but it takes really long-term intent. And our work is based on the principles of James Heckman. Let's bring a Nobel economist into the room. And James Heckman's research does great work. I think there are two things which stand out for me, and it's what Steven said earlier: start early, so begin early to support disadvantaged children, but also keep that support up. So don't drop disadvantaged children when they get to high school thinking that all is well, not when you have highly vulnerable children, because there will be a dimension of poverty that will continue to play out. And James Heckman's research is pretty clear that if you provide early intervention and balanced support over children's lifetime till they're on their feet in young adulthood, the impact is you get a whole lot more children completing Year 12, you get a lot more children in university, and conversely, you get far fewer people in the welfare system, and perhaps more telling of all, you have far fewer young people in jail.
And I think one of the things that's interesting me, and one of the worrying thing to me, is that we've sort of moved to talking about disadvantage really quickly, from talking about underachievement, and now disadvantage is covering the whole conversation. And that's the worrying thing for me, because the distribution of students who fail to achieve those basic proficiency levels that we talked about before is extremely skewed, and that disadvantaged students very much disproportionately make up the long tail of underachievement in Australia. And that's the thing to me that's the most worrying about the whole thing. If it was evenly distributed, we would look at it as a national problem. Because it's not evenly distributed, it's amongst disadvantaged students, that it becomes something for someone else to address. It's something that the Smith family have to work on, or it's something that classroom teachers need to work on, instead of it being about everybody has to work on this problem. And just for example, when we're looking at those base levels, we can see that almost 1 in 3 disadvantaged students don't meet those base levels for the UN sustainability goals in reading, maths or science. And that compares to about 1 in 10 from an advantaged background. So when you've got 1 in 3 compared to 1 in 10, that's an enormous difference. And I think that's, to me, one of the most worrying things. And Chris Bonner's called it the tenacious grip of family background on student achievement. And it does seem to be tenacious, even given the wish of parents and the aspirations of parents. Nobody would expect that just because you're low socioeconomic status that you don't have those aspirations for your kids. Of course you do, but you may not know your way around the system. You may not know your way around the education system if you have not completed your education yourself. There are all those sort of issues that are stacked up against low or disadvantaged families that I think we have to recognise and work on as a country, and we're not doing that at the moment. And that's, to me, why we've still got that long tail, because we're not addressing those basic issues that we need to be addressing if we want to really cut that tail down to a little stumpy tail, which is what I'd like to see. Stephen.
Beautifully said. Yeah, totally agree. I think the reporting of PISA and TIMSS and PEARLS and those sort of things, often we get a league table or a ranking of countries. But as soon as you dig anywhere deeper, and obviously I don't dig as deep as Sue does, writing the report, I merely read it. You always see Indigenous, rural, remote. Like you can paint it by numbers before you even crack the report. Each 4 years that it arrives on our desks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not something that's seeing any traction, or something that feels like, from my perspective, that it's being acted on. But to be optimistic, I have to say, in Victoria at least, the post-COVID, we've had like tutoring being rolled out. For me, this is my 11th year of teaching. This is the first time I've seen genuine intervention to catch students up. And I'm hoping that that's not something that's just a temporary fix. The Firth review is looking at, vocational education pathways, because at the moment it's like either or. You're either academic or you're not, and the goal will be to make it more of a balanced approach that's doable. And the big investment in disability funding should cut into, hopefully, some of this tail in the form of students with learning disabilities or disabilities themselves. And sort of, as soon as we get that kind of fragmentation of, rather than just a long tail, but we can actually identify students and groups and locations and work to address that through mostly system level things rather than teacher level things, then I think we'll be on the right track. So we're heading in the right direction. Let's hope, as Anne said earlier, that it's an ongoing commitment.
Stephen, I think the tutoring is going to be really interesting. We've started a very small initiative ourselves in that regard, and it's tutoring over online for some of our students who have. So very small, but one of the things we were interested in is doing it in the home learning environment, because I think that can really also complement what happens at school. And we weren't sure whether or not our students, as I've spoken, they're highly disadvantaged. We weren't actually sure whether or not they would be willing to do tutoring in their own time 3 days a week. I don't know about you, that's a big ask. And also we did it pretty well over the Christmas holidays. We've had extraordinary attendance at that. So like you, we think if that's going to be effective, it could be not only effective for trying to respond to COVID, but also more broadly some of the gaps that we know already existed pre-COVID.
Yeah, a reasonable follow-up to this discussion. Given the context, there seems to be a lot of expectations around how this gets addressed. And one of the things I'd like to ask my panelists to discuss is, what kind of expectations does this issue place on teachers and on schools? How realistic is it that we sort of expect teachers to deliver things like differentiated or individualized instruction in every classroom for every group of students or each individual? Are the deepest roots of this issue in the classroom, or should we be looking in other places? Stephen, should we start with you?
I feel I should go first and try not to dig a hole too deep for myself. But basically, my answer is yes, it is unreasonable. And that's the answer to that is simple. We, as Australia, are above the OECD average on class time face-to-face, essentially. So every year, the students that we face become more complex, more diagnoses, more complex things that need to be addressed, and that's because of this long tail. So as the tail gets longer, the levels within our class become more broad, basically. So you're not teaching in a narrow range of a year and a half. This kid's maybe a little bit cleverer, this kid's a little bit less clever, perhaps. You're dealing with, we're talking 5-6 years behind. You're talking presentations that of neurodiversity. So you're thinking about ways to address a brain that is dissimilar to yours as a neurotypical person. There's a whole layer of complexity, and each one of the complexities is sort of a separate area of study that researchers are sitting around and discussing and arguing about. And unless we have less time face to face in front of students, then we won't have the time that we require to prepare for those students to make modified, differentiated, and maybe one day personalised. But that's a very distant goal that we've been talking about as educationalists for many generations. So that's probably a discussion for a separate time. But yeah, the complexity, the intensification of teacher work is continuing apace, and the amount of time that we're in front of students, the time that we can't be preparing and modifying, stays the same. So until I see changes around that, you can fund as much as you want, but I can't be completing, a master's in things that I need to learn if I'm spending all my time in front of students, marking their work, all Sunday, and then there's no spare time to do the sort of forward-thinking work that I'd like to be doing about how can I, upskill, how can I help this student with particularly extreme needs.
I think they're really good points, and I think that all of that is borne out by, I was just thinking of the recent TALIS report as well. So teachers are not only spending more time than above the OECD average face-to-face teaching, they're also spending far more time on marking, on general administrative work in the school that's not related necessarily to their teaching. And one of the things that they don't get, which I think is really important and has been shown in some of the high-performing countries such as Singapore, is that they don't get the time for mentoring or being mentored or learning from other teachers. And I remember being, first few years out of teaching myself, one of the things that was really valuable was observing other teachers, seeing how the experts taught. Because you come into a classroom, you're not an expert when you start off. You need to learn and you need to grow and you need to develop those skills. But if you're thrown into a classroom and yes, you get a little bit of leeway in the first couple of years, but then, then really not much. It's a very big workload. And as Stephen said, and when he was talking about the differences in students, there were differences in students there that we never thought about when I was teaching. So differences in, in the way students learn, in the way they learn that's different to the way that you teach or the way that you learn, all of those things that are so very different and do help make up that tail of underachievement. All of those things take time to learn how to do. And I think it's time we really stopped expecting teachers to work 60-hour weeks plus weekends to try and do all of these things without, we should stop expecting people to work those hours anyway. They're just crazy hours. But they're not getting enough professional time to go and watch other people or do what they need to do. I agree.
And Catherine, I think we'd all be really familiar with John Hattie's research about in-school factors and out-of-school factors. And I think, that the out-of-school factors in terms of the family and the home learning environment is incredibly important. I think there's also good research about one of the things that teachers feel, perhaps, I'll generalise, and I think we're all ex-teachers or current teachers here, that teachers generally find a little bit challenging is the interaction with families. And it's not something that I think is generally very well taught, although the parent engagement literature would tell us that that's a bigger predictor of educational outcomes than socioeconomic background. So an engaged parent, so if we can support parents to be engaged in their children in meaningful ways, and I'll come back to in meaningful ways, then that's a bigger predictor than socioeconomic background. I think historically, and I'll simplify it, but I think historically we've thought parental engagement in a child's education as being at the tuck shop. But there's very strong evidence about the sort of parental engagement which does make a difference, and it's helping parents, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, but not only disadvantaged backgrounds, to understand, well, what does make a difference? How do the conversations that I have with my child around the dinner table or in front of the TV or going to school actually help them feel engaged or disengaged, help them set goals or not set goals? And I think that's one of those areas that we haven't, as a public policy initiative, we haven't leveraged the capacity of families in a way that would be truly meaningful and useful. And that's why the starting point for the Smith Family's Learning for Life Scholarship Program is a respectful partnership with families around their child's educational outcomes.
There's an oft-quoted mantra in education that I've heard certainly repeatedly, that the teacher is the biggest in-school factor in student success, influencing student success. And I've also heard it suggested that if we change the distribution of teacher and school leader expertise so that we really aligned high-level skills from those adults that are in the school, education leaders, with high-need situations on the student side. How does Australia do in that kind of alignment, and how could we improve? Sue?
Well, I don't think we do align that very well. I think that we have a long way that we could improve on that. We need to attract bright young people into teaching. We need to attract more of them, and then we need to keep them there. And I think that we also need to attract them to certain areas of teaching. So if I'd go back, it sounds like I'd be harping on it, but if we went back to disadvantaged students in disadvantaged schools, we would find that, according to TALIS, they have a lot more, they have even less time in the classroom than Stephen was suggesting before. So disadvantaged teachers in disadvantaged schools spend less time actually teaching than students in advantaged schools. And it adds up over the period of a year. It adds up to weeks of time. So that's weeks of time that kids in advantaged schools, who probably don't need it quite as much, are getting compared to disadvantaged kids. They have more trouble attracting and retaining good teachers. They have more trouble with all of those sort of things. And to me, that's part of the problem, again, is that we're not, how are we attracting people, and how are we attracting high skill level staff into disadvantaged schools where they need to be, and the kids that particularly need them? How are we doing that? And we're not at the moment. It is, I can imagine, why would you choose to teach in a really hard school when you can teach somewhere that's much easier and maybe you will get the weekends off? Those are choices that people make all the time. I don't blame anybody for those choices, but there needs to be a way of getting more teachers into those disadvantaged schools so that those kids get more of a chance to do well and break out of that tail. And maybe Smith Family wouldn't need to provide so many places. It's always,
we're trying to do ourselves out of a job, that.
Whenever we've got this many student placements this year, we're doing really well, and part of my heart sinks because I think we shouldn't need these things. We shouldn't need these things at all, but we do. Smith Family, fortunately, amongst others, are there to try and pick it up. but we really need to see how well we match those things, and we're not at the moment. Stephen, I'm sure you have another hole to dig on that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, let's see if I can keep myself out of trouble again. So I think we focus perhaps too much, in the broader debate about initial teacher education, and sort of, especially because if you keep in mind, and the statistics on this are a bit fuzzy, the more you research, the less clear it becomes. But people wildly speculate that 40-50% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years. Whether that's establishable or not is a separate question, but that's generally understood. So to me, it should be something. The other thing that we know is that monetary incentives don't really work in this respect. So if you turned up at my door and said, we'll give you $1 million to travel to the Northern Territory, I then have to think about, okay, well, wife, son, home loan, all these complicated things. It's not as simple as, have a bag of cash, go sort it out. And so it is a much more complicated thing than that. And also, as Sue was saying, when you go out to a rural school, you have much higher teacher turnover because they come in, they're not really seeing the changes that they'd like to have because they spend more time on discipline and follow-up than they do in teaching, perhaps. And so then you get, these students are constantly meeting another bright and shiny first-year teacher who is then eaten alive, as is colloquially said, and then another one turns up the next year or maybe during the year. So that's the kind of problem, to make it quite blunt. That's the kind of issue that we're dealing with. And what you also get is out of area teaching. So you're being taught physics by a teacher who trained as a humanities teacher, and then again you can see how that would extend the tail of disadvantage. And so, especially geographically, Australia's quite central around its cities, and then quite dispersed after that. And so, really serious work needs to be thought about how we can do this much better, because at the moment it's a very complex and thorny problem.
Yeah. We didn't even get into the discussion of out of field teaching, and that's a whole other ball game, that one. But you're right, and the TALIS report shows that it's more likely that disadvantaged kids will be taught by out of field teachers. So it's like every strike is there, compounding the disadvantage that they're coming to school with. And when Anne was talking about the NAPLAN studies before from Grattan, if they start at the same point in grade 3 and they're widely different at year 9, what do you do when they start school 5 years difference, with 5 years difference between them? And we've heard people talking about that. I'm sure all of you have, where we're talking about prep teachers who are saying, I have kids in here who can read and write fluently, and I have kids in here who are doing little scribbles and can't do anything more than that. How does a teacher teach a prep classroom of 25 kids where you've got that range of problems, that range of abilities? And so putting high quality teachers in with more high quality teachers in with those kids would make a huge difference.
I am going to ask my favorite question as the last one. There are several good ones in the Q&A if we have time to play around teaching, but I'm going to ask my favorite. So if each of you had unlimited funds and resources, whatever you wanted, and you could expend it on one concrete aspect of this problem, what would you choose and why would you choose it? So you want to start with you?
Yes, I think mine would be fairly easy. I would pump all of the money I could get into early childhood education. I would put as many teachers as I could, as many qualified teachers and trained teachers, aides, whatever, into early childhood education. So preschool, prep, grade 1, grade 2, so that every single kid who couldn't read could read by the time they were in grade 2. That would be my wish, I think. Anne, how about you?
I think that's a great one, Sue, because how children start school then really sets them up going forward. I think Australia will find it very difficult to address the long tail of disadvantage unless we address the 1.2 million children living in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a colleague in the South Australian Department of Education who I have enormous respect for, who said to me recently, we have very good schools, we have very good teachers, but we cannot teach our way out of poverty. And so I think we do need, and it isn't a simple answer, but we actually, I think, fundamentally need as a society to work to significantly reduce that 1.2 million children living in poverty, because there are so many consequences in education for living in poverty. And we've seen that in the data that we've talked about today. That's not going to be one simple response, but I think we need as a society to A, know about that large number, B, care about it, and then work together across all levels of government and all sectors to address that, what has been an intractable issue, because there are then the consequences for education, but also health, and we could go on, juvenile justice system and beyond.
Steven?
Well, how do I follow those two? I'll go quite realistic and easy then. So if we've cured poverty and we've got all of the students can read, then it's easy for me to say, as I'm assuming all of these wishes have come true already for mine, because that makes it easier for me. And then I'll just propose that we upskill the teachers, give them less time in class, allow them more time to collaborate, so that they may then address the remaining disadvantage after every student can read and poverty is solved.
It's eliminated.
I'll focus on the teachers.
There have been some good questions in the Q&A, and there are a number around teacher training, teacher assignment, and teacher development that we don't have time, because unfortunately we've only got about 5 minutes left. Yeah, so I'm gonna pick this one arbitrarily and say it's a question somebody cited you, so you may get to open with it. This is following suit on this comment about supporting teachers. What does the panel feel that universities can do to help support teachers within the profession in the areas discussed?
That's a good question. I'll have a go at that. I think that I think Stephen's right. I think it's not concentrating on pre-service education that's the most important thing. I think you get your basics of what you need to do, but you can't be taught everything until you can't learn everything until you're actually in the classroom facing the kids and know what you have to learn. It's like always, I don't know what questions to ask before I go in there, so I don't know what I need to know. But then it's about empowering teachers to get back into education and to learn more, to do short courses, to do longer courses, to do whatever they need to do. And I know Stephen's done that, for example, and that's actually how I ended up where I am, because I started doing different courses and got sucked in by the research then. But it's learning how to deal with those different things. And so it's encouraging teachers and giving them the time to go back. So what I would say universities can do to support that is to be looking at ways of delivering in-service education or training or further education, looking at ways of that's cat number 2. Ways of delivering that education to teachers so that it's accessible, and looking at ways, and I'm sure that they're doing this, looking at ways of delivering it to distance in terms of distance, so that wherever you are, you can pick up a course and do it. And I think that would be what I would suggest for universities. Stephen?
I would just echo that as well. If this webinar is the first time you've heard about the Learning for Life program, then you're not alone. For me, and I just feel like, how is that something that is not something that me in a school is aware of, that I can be tapping into and working alongside? And so that would be the thing that I would ask universities to do as well. We talk about the concept of a pracademic, a practitioner, academic combined, academics meeting with teachers and working collaboratively, and that would also be relevant for the charity space as well. I would love to have the time to do that and to be able to do that more effectively, but that's definitely something that we as teachers, academics, and all the spaces involved in education need to come together and try and build a bridge between our respective institutions.
There's also a related question from someone. So there has also been conversation of an apprenticeship approach to teaching, and wondering what the thoughts of the panel are for that one. Steven, since you're on my screen, would you like to start with that one?
Yeah, I think teaching is always an apprenticeship. More or less, that's what Sue was driving towards just then. It's kind of I could give you a PhD in 5 separate fields of study in education, but until you hit the classroom and you realise that autism spectrum disorder looks like this, and it's manifested in this multitude of ways, and then you go back and look at the research and say, okay, now I can draw, through lines between what I'm seeing and what I've learned. I don't know. I don't think there's any other way to become a teacher than to do it through an apprenticeship, whether we call it that or not. We call it the apprenticeship of experience. That's to me how it is and how it always will be.
I agree, and I think that it's important, very important in an apprenticeship that you have good people training those apprentices. And so, more time to spend with those people learning the trade, if you like. And so I think I agree with Stephen. I think that it is an apprenticeship, but it needs to be, we need to give people the time to learn, and we don't do that at the moment very well.
For my
teacher, you think about that?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry. I don't have strong views either way. I think the notion of teachers as professionals is probably quite important to teachers as well. But I think the way that Stephen's used it, it could also work very much as well. That constant learner, as I think we all are in all of our professions.
Well, I will give you one comment from the Q&A. It's actually not a question, it's a comment for all three of you. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion. The panel was fantastic. Bring on more of these valuable discussions. And with that, we are just about out of time. So I'd like to thank you all for sharing your insights with us today. It was fascinating and I learned a lot. And to all the participants who came in and asked a lot of really excellent questions that unfortunately we're not going to have time to get all of answered, but we will try to do that in writing. We hope to see you for the next webinar in the series, which is Wednesday on the 5th of May at 4 p.m., Getting All Children Off to the Best Start in Life. We hope to see you then. Thank you.